What I want to do is to kick this off. I want to start with the most obvious of places, and which is basically your biography. I know we are having a conversation, but it will be good for you to really situate for us how you came to embody the kind of politics that you have been espousing for the past 50 years. And I read somewhere that you were in the military, which kind of reminds me of, Frantz Fanon has this idea that a state of emergency is always a possible state of emergence. So it's not the violence of colonial domination, for instance, always also secretes the counter apparatus of its destruction. You are in the military, one of the most violent organizations that exist.
Exactly.
And here you are. So maybe walk us through and give us like a trajectory of your own political, intellectual, and spiritual journey and how it got you here.
Okay. Well, first, let me thank you, and let me thank the organizers for bringing us together this evening here in Toronto. I see a number of old friends here, and I'm glad to see you again. I was here back in 2019 for a tour. The plan was to cover the eastern part of the country and come back in 2020. But of course, something happened in 2020 that prevented us coming back, so I'm glad to be here this evening. I'm not going to spend too much time on my background, but I think a foundation is important, especially when you lead with the fact that I was, in fact, in the military of the #1 imperialist power on this planet many, many years ago. But as you said, it was part of my development, part of the reality that I was born into. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, grew up in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And it was a very, very, as we all know, very interesting time to be alive. And I'm so glad I'm still here. But it was a situation in which I had a chance to see and to experience firsthand the contradictions of this colonial capitalist system. I lived it. We grew up dirt poor. I lived in what they call a kitchenette apartment. That is, these landlords or these, entrepreneurs would buy houses, and then they would divide them up. A single family house, they'll divide up and put 4 families in that house, because we were still at the tail end of the second Great Migration. So many, many people were still coming to Chicago from the South, primarily from Mississippi. My family is also from Mississippi, and it came north with my grandfather in the early 19-teens. And so we lived in a house that with 3 other families. We shared one bathroom, and some of you may know that back in those days, the families were quite large. In fact, my family was a small family, and there was 5 kids. So we saw and experienced what it means to be poor and black, to be part of the working class, to have opportunities shut in your face, to be exposed to all of the temptations one is exposed to in an urban environment where you're trying to survive. And what I also saw, though, was as a consequence of the particular dynamics of my family, we had a blended class dynamic. That is, while my father was, and all of us, we were poor, he had brothers who were part of the middle class. And so as a consequence of that, we had a chance to move out of that situation and move into better conditions when my uncle bought a building and then allowed us to come to the building, but we were confined to an apartment in the basement, a half-finished basement apartment. So guess what I started seeing? Not only did I understand what it meant to be black, I started seeing in concrete terms class contradictions in the black community. And that was the beginning of me understanding that it wasn't just enough to have a framework, a theoretical framework in which the issue was just on race, as important as race is, but that we had to, in fact, connect that to the notion, the issue, the reality of class. So that kind of background was what began to compel me to get more involved politically. But I found myself being subjected to the U.S. draft at that time. This was the beginning, this was the latter part of the Vietnam conflict. And I know very few people may remember this, but in the U.S., there was a lottery in which they threw everybody's birthdays into a big drum. And every year they would have a thing on television, they would do the drum, and then they would pull out the birthdays and put them on a wall. And so the lower your lottery was, the more you were subjected to being drafted that year. And it did all 365 days. Well, when I was getting ready to turn 19, my lottery number was 8. That meant it was a certainty I was going into the military. And so one way in which you could get around just being drafted into the military and being sent straight to the infantry, which is where they sent most black folks, and then you end up on the front lines of Vietnam. You could join for 3 years, and you had some latitude. So that's what I did to get out of the ghetto, and that's how I ended up in the military. But the military is one of the environments where one could be radicalized. In those days, there were probably 3 places where you could be radicalized: in prison, in school, and in the military. And so for those of us who were grappling with trying to understand our realities and the world, I had a chance to be connected with a number of politicized young men, and that helped to fashion my worldview, and I became an activist. I was part of the GI movement in the military in the early 1970s. That's how I got into the military. Once I came out of the military, I went straight to the South to join the movement, and I've been involved ever since.
Thank you so much. Okay, but given your experience, right, like and thank you for really taking us into this, because it allows us to be able to see how these institutions that we may see as oppressive also actually become areas or sites for radicalization, right? Like the military, for instance. But we are now in this place where the military is on our mind a lot, right? And the Western media and most Western governments say there is a very clear danger and threat, not by the political systems, not by neoliberal decimation of communities, not by the constriction of the political space, and almost a unification or kind of consensus in the political space and among the political and business classes. But it is really that we have to look at China, and we have to look at Russia, and especially what Russia is doing in Ukraine, right? And so I wanted to ask the question, what do you think is the most pressing issue, given your background, given your experience of organizing, and given what we are being told by the Western media and our governments? I'll give you a quick example. We ended up honoring a real-life Nazi in our parliament.
I saw that.
This is not Azov-type Nazi. This is old school.
Yes.
The Banderites, right? And Trudeau, like, instead of, just apologizing to Canadians, it's like, oh, we should be careful, Russian propaganda. I'm like, the Russians did not make you honor a Nazi in parliament. Anyway, so what do you think is so for them, that's where we should be focusing our attention. Right. What do you think is, in this conjuncture, the most pressing issue, and how do you think we could combat it?
There's no question that the war in Ukraine is the major issue right now because of the the possibility of it escalating into a conflict between two nuclear powers that can end life as we know it on this planet. It's really amazing to me that there's not a greater sense of urgency to address this conflict. But instead, we have a steady drumbeat of pro-war propaganda that's coming from the most of the so-called collective West that has now defined so-called success in Ukraine as the defeat of the Russian Federation. Now, that is a very dangerous position because the leadership in this country, Trudeau, I think is reflective of the kind of incompetent, amateurish leadership that we see throughout the entire Western world with Emmanuel Macron and Joe Biden, Boris Johnson. These are individuals who are really not up to the historical moment. These are very dangerous times, but ironically, dangerous times at a moment where the leadership in the West is the most incompetent. So the possibility of mistakes being made that could escalate into a direct confrontation is really more dangerous than the last crisis, which was 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Ukraine is it because we have this proxy war, this war that was, I get in trouble because I call things as I see it. And while it's framed as a Putin's war, and let me first have to say this because, as soon as we start talking about this conflict, and because of the constant propaganda, one has to then be careful because now you become a Putin apologist and spreading Russian propaganda. I don't deal with personalities. I make objective assessments of social forces and class struggles, national struggles. The war in Ukraine is a conflict that did not have to happen. And I don't accept the analysis of the position that it started in February 2022. That to me it liquidates the reality of the 14,000 people whose lives were snuffed out in a conflict that started in 2014. A conflict that started in 2014 when the coup government supported by the United States of America and its Western allies gave a green light to these Nazi elements that had come into the state through their National Guard and decided they were going to attack Ukrainian citizens in the East who opposed the coup. Okay? Now, you might recall that one of the justifications for the support for the conflict, for the intervention into Syria, was because Assad had attacked his own citizens. That was the justification for the humanitarian intervention, okay? Well, the same thing was happening in eastern Ukraine, but there was a very interesting kind of twist to it, the way they framed it in the Western press. You see those Ukrainians who lived in the East, who had voted for Viktor Yanukovych, the president, and then who opposed the coup, they became non-citizens. They became pro-Russian separatists, which meant basically they became killable. They lost their humanity. They were part of the enemy. And so they were, in fact, subjected to attacks. And you had a conflict, and there was a stalemate. But in the process of 8 years of so-called stalemate, 14,000 people lost their lives. The negotiations taking place between the Russian Federation and the U.S., when it became clear that the U.S. was prepared to bring Ukraine into NATO, and the Russians were opposed to that, wanted to negotiate a security architecture that could avoid conflict. It was quite clear that the Biden administration was committed to a conflict, in my opinion, that they basically had given a green light to initiating what they thought was going to be a relatively contained proxy war in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, that has escalated out of control. So this war that now has consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, is in fact a major conflict. But understand this though. If I ask the audience right now, in the last 2.5 years, where have we seen the greatest loss of life from an armed conflict? Number one, where is that conflict? Where have we seen the greatest loss of life? Is it Ukraine? Where? No. In the last 2.5 years. Not yet. Last 2.5 years, the greatest loss of life from conflict occurred in Ethiopia. That you had a conflict in which over 600,000 people lost their lives. In a conflict that, in my opinion, did not have to happen either. Okay? But who cares about conflicts in which Africans die? Just like who cares about the fact that one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in the last decade or so is in Yemen, Obama's war. So this is, all of these conflicts to me represent the commitment that we see toward militarism, this desperate attempt on the part of the collective West under the leadership of the U.S. to maintain its global hegemony. So long response to your question. Ukraine is key, not because of the volume of life that's lost, as insane and obscene as that is, but because of the possibility of escalation, because the West has put itself in a position where there's no way out besides escalation. Now, what we're seeing is that there's exhaustion, so now they are moving, trying to figure out how to get out of this, but it's still a very dangerous situation because of, as I said, the low-level character of the leadership in the collective West.
Okay, I have two follow-up questions, but before, let me just predicate it by this. When Poroshenko was president of Ukraine, for instance, there are videos of him saying the children in Donbass will stay in the basement, our kids will go to school. Like, there are videos like that. You don't have to dig too far to see that, right?
Exactly.
But if you were to state that, and I'm not in favor of war, but if you were to say, well, this happened, you bomb Libya to the Stone Age, and now there is a crisis and nobody's paying attention. For the past 11 years, it's militarizing the whole of the Sahel region in Africa. Nobody pays attention because, right? And even when the war started in Ukraine, you had this idea where they were saying we should care for Ukraine because they are blonde hair, blue-eyed. Mm-hmm. Not appealing to general humanity. Like, people are dying. You could appeal that way, but that's not what they were saying. Mr. Putin brought war to Europe. So you are saying brown and black people should be bombed because we are the ones that should just engage in war. This is why Ethiopia, for instance, right? But what of those who would say, what of the agency of the Ukrainians? You may have heard that. If Ukraine wants to join NATO because they are living next to the big bad wolf or bear, mm-hmm. Why should they then be allowed to join NATO? So that is one. But the second thing really is, I just mentioned Libya and the Sahel region, but also the violence, and I think in one of your pieces you refer to it as the political economy of militarization, mm-hmm. right? So on the one hand, I want you to really respond to that question where people will say, but you can't just blame the West for what is happening. Russia is also culpable in this. On the other hand, there is also a war machine. Raytheon and all of these guys are making, which you really rightly describe as, the political economy of militarization that is taking place in the world. Mm-hmm. So I want you to just oppose the two. Mm-hmm. Aren't the Ukrainians allowed to be able to defend their country or to join whatever alliance to protect themselves? Mm-hmm. But also, bearing in mind that that idea of we are going to defend ourselves is also situated within a larger global political economy or geopolitical machination in which militarization and the extension of violence, liberal regime change regimes and also are at play. And another leg of that, of course, in that political economy is big corporations, war-making corporations that produce weapons that are also fueling this kind of conflict. And finally, what do you think the black radical tradition and black organizations, such as, like, for instance, the Black Alliance for Peace, will play in all of this? So I think this is a double barrel question, really.
A
There
triple
are like
barrel.
Okay, triple barrel question.
No, it's but very important because all these things are so fundamentally linked. Of course, states have a right to protect themselves. Self-defense is a fundamental right, no question about that. But in international law, when you begin to talk about security, security architecture and security issues between various states, is understood that the security of one state should not be at the cost of the insecurity of another state. Okay, and so in the negotiations between the Russian Federation and the Biden administration, there was serious conversation about what would security look like for Ukraine. Was it necessary for the U.S. to continue to push for Ukraine to be a part of NATO? Everyone warned the U.S. authorities for quite some time, in particular in 2008, when they made the announcement that they had intended to bring Ukraine into NATO, that it was going to be problematic. Even war criminals like Henry Kissinger understood that. But again, the idealism and the arrogance of Western decision makers was such that they believed that they could continue the expansion right up to Russia's border without any real consequences. And so, you know, that right of Ukraine is something that is important, is recognized, but also the right to security for the Russians. And it became quite clear over the last few years that the U.S. was building one of the most, well, in fact, the most formidable military force on the European continent in Ukraine. And it wasn't just for defensive purposes, okay? There was an agreement that could have avoided the conflict in Ukraine that was completely jettisoned. It was called the Minsk Agreement, okay? This was the agreement that came out of the conflict when it started back in 2014. But we discovered, or we knew, but it was acknowledged by Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel that that agreement was only to provide time to build the military forces in Ukraine. They were angling toward conflict. So this is something that's been on the table, and so it impacted those negotiations. The Russians were serious about trying to ensure that they had security, that they weren't going to be subjected to some kind of military action. But those concerns were completely ignored. Now, why? And it goes back to the second part of your question in terms of this political economy of militarization. The motivation wasn't just the pursuit of profit, even though it was, but it had there was long-term geopolitical issues here that they felt they could, and objectives that they felt they could accomplish, that is, U.S. policymakers. They wanted to basically ensure that one aspect of their hegemony was to make sure that they still had significant control and influence in Europe, economically and politically. And one way in which you do that is you begin to try to disarticulate the Russian economy from the European economy. And the fact that the Russians were selling cheap energy to the Germans, which was the driving economic power in Europe, it served as a brake for U.S. hegemony in Europe. And so using this excuse of a Russian threat, they continued the process of moving toward war. That's why when the conflict finally started, and Joe Biden had warned everybody that once the conflict started, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline wasn't going to be functional because they already had the plan in place to blow up the infrastructure of Germany in order to disconnect the German economy from the Russian economy. So it is about profit, but it's about geostrategic objectives. And without going into a whole lot of more details in terms of how this occurred, why they had to pursue military objectives for hegemony in Europe as opposed to political, connected to things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was then squashed when Trump won, which was connected to the Transatlantic Investment Partnership that was going to be the mechanism in which the U.S. was going to consolidate control in Europe. When that didn't happen, it meant that the military option became more pronounced. So it was geostrategic objectives and profit. The energy companies and the military-industrial complex has made obscene profits over the last year, okay? So they are meeting their geostrategic objectives, and they also are making a whole lot of money in the process, okay? This is reflective of not just this by accident. This is part of U.S. Strategy, U.S. policy. They are committed to what they have defined as full spectrum dominance. They're committed, is not a secret, is in their national security strategy, that they are prepared to do whatever they need to do to maintain global hegemony, including attacking and destroying regional powers, Libya and Africa, okay? Undermining Venezuela and Latin America, attacking another, what I consider to be neoliberal regime in Africa, which is, well, I don't want to go into Ethiopia. Okay, I know there's controversy around that. But this is what they are doing. Their control in Europe basically is to cut off the Russians. So this is a money-making process and is a part of the global hegemonic project on the part of the U.S., primarily with their vassal states in Europe, including this vassal state that we call Canada.
Okay. Whilst you were speaking, you left the third part of my question, but I will come to that, which is, but whilst you were speaking, the issue then comes up, right? Because when you listen to Western officials speak, it's not about money making. They don't represent it that way. It's represented as a clash between democracy and liberalism versus authoritarianism and stuff, right? Now, I know I have to throw this out there.
Yeah.
But the thing that is interesting about this, and this is a concern, which is really also what the conversation we're having zeroes on, is the particular kind of reactionary politics that has been emerging within our own backyards. And the way in which, especially around the war in Ukraine, the way in which every attempt is being made to try and silence any alternative voice that tries to question. Even if you are not in support of what Russia is doing, or you say, I want, for us to have like a righteous peace in resolving this issue, it becomes about things that we know, becomes about repeating Russian propaganda. I mean, the one that beats me is to say, Trudeau was telling us, don't fall for Russian propaganda. I was laughing. I'm like, no, the Russians did not tell you to give a standing ovation to somebody right? But that's what, and it's not only stopping there. In the US, actually, they started going after, like, black groups, radical groups. Like I know the People's Forum, Marco Rubio was calling for the People's Forum to be sanctioned in a kind of new McCarthyism that is developing.
Yes.
Like, okay, so before we get to the question of what the black radical tradition or racialized people or peace-loving people, whatever you want to call them, could do for this moment, let us really look under the hood in terms of this new kind of sanctions, and I'm not talking of economic sanction, I'm talking about the way in which we are sanctioning speech. Certain things you can't say.
Right.
People are afraid to say certain things. Meanwhile, everything that they have been telling us not to think of, it's basically keep revealing itself. Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, came out and told us that Russia actually sent them a treaty saying, let's reorganize and rethink the security of Europe. Don't expand. And they were like, no. And so in actual fact, when Russia was saying they were responsible for the war, when you repeated that, they will say you are repeating Russian propaganda. But the Western officials themselves are now making the same claims. So, but if you were to make that claim, they sanction you. I think there are groups in the US that are under federal FBI investigation and stuff. So what do you think about that? I think the question here really is there a way in which we could oppose liberalism and this kind of, the way in which they want us to believe in terms of authoritarian versus liberal? Or has liberalism itself taken on the role of a neo-fascist ideology where it tries to force people to think in a very particular way?
I think one of the most dangerous developments over the last few years has been the fact that it's quite clear that liberalism has been jettisoned by the ruling element. The neoliberal ruling class has concluded that the continuation of liberal democracy is not in their best interest. Now, they will keep the forms of it, so we get a chance to go, at least in the U.S., and go and vote every 2 or 4 years for whatever element is going to oppress us. But in terms of real substance, it doesn't really exist. And now to strengthen that control over the population, they have used, I think quite creatively, Russiagate to lay the ideological foundation for what we see today in terms of the conflict, but also more importantly, to move toward normalizing an ideological conformity that just happens to correspond with their worldview and their interests. So I've been making the argument, and it's been a little controversial in the U.S., that while, for example, during the 4 years of the Trump administration, where everybody was focused on Donald Trump as the face of fascism, and that movement is in fact dangerous. For me, the real driving force of fascism, or a particular form of fascism in the U.S., has been the neoliberal ruling class that actually controls the state. Okay, and using this Donald Trump and then the war, and with their alliance with the big tech companies and the bourgeois media, they have been systematically imposing a kind of ideological conformity in the U.S. and globally, because now you will be censored, you will be punished if you take positions that are not in accordance with their orthodoxy. So if you critique the Ukrainian war is evolution, then you are framed as a Putin apologist or whatever, and you could be thrown off before Musk took over, thrown off for Twitter and put in the Facebook doghouse, and all kind of things can happen to you, okay? You could actually lose your positions, you can be sanctioned, you can be deplatformed. I've been deplatformed in the U.S. Because if you take a critical position, if you have a different kind of analysis, then you're subject to that kind of repression. And they have gone even further. Now, for example, there's an organization called the African People's Socialist Party. It's been in place for almost 50 years, taking consistent anti-imperialist positions for decades, from the very beginning. The U.S. has the Justice Department. They have indicted the leadership of that formation, Omala Yeshitela, who's the chairperson of that organization, indicted him and 2 other individuals who are part of the Uhuru movement, indicted them suggesting that they are agents of the Russian Federation. Why? Because they have taken a consistent position opposed to U.S. imperialism. There was a radical meeting, black radical meeting in June in the U.S., and there was a side conversation around what was happening with Yeshitela. And so the discussion was, well, Now they have indicted O'Malley. Who do you all think is next? And guess whose name came up? So I'm laying that out because if they do come after me, we need some help and some support, okay? Because we're not going to take one step backward. We're going to call things as we see it, okay? So yes, this is the environment we have in the U.S. Not only do you have the indictments, how many people heard about the struggles taking place in Atlanta, Georgia, around Cop City? This is an attempt to build a facility where they're going to enhance the ability of the police forces in the U.S., in Georgia and other parts of the U.S., and there's been resistance to this. Well, the protesters have been designated as domestic terrorists, okay? And then they came out with a 61-count RICO indictment. This is conspiracy, okay? This is liberal democracy. This is liberalism. This is free speech and the right to have dissenting ideas. And we see a similar kind of phenomenon developing here in this other bastion of liberalism here in Canada, okay? If you don't have the right kind of perspective, then basically you could be subjected, maybe not yet, to criminal prosecution, but you definitely can, it appears, to be subjected to all kinds of career constraints and everything else. This is the danger. This is the new form of fascism. You see, we have this notion of fascism based on all these bad Hitler movies we've been watching over the decades, not understanding that what is the essence of fascism but the merger of the corporate sector with the state. And it's already happened, okay? And so this new McCarthyism that we see emerging is to provide support to maintain the hegemony of this ruling element. They understand that they are facing a crisis of legitimacy. And they have determined for themselves that basically they are going to shut down discussion, shut down opposition in order to maintain their hegemony. And so this is the most dangerous moment we've faced ever, because even with McCarthy #1 back in the 1950s, the objective was to shut down domestic opposition because the ruling class was consolidating its forces for hegemony, okay? But there was still opposition. Today, they're more desperate because they really are facing a irreversible crisis. And so they're more desperate, and it is no telling how far they're prepared to go. And so the space for real opposition, for democratic discourse, for protecting real human rights has been constricting over the last few years, and it's a very dangerous environment in the U.S. And I think it's a precursor of what's going to happen here in Canada eventually.
Okay. I want us to open this up. I have a question that I wanted to ask regarding returning back to the question of what then should black radical groups do to challenge this. And one thing is, of course, Cornel West is running for president of the United States. And we might ask the question, well, why are we talking about the United States? Well, the United States is a major player, and whosoever becomes president there has a real power to change or intervene in the way in world order in a very specific way. But we'll get back to that. So let's open this up. People ask questions, and another thing also is that, are you saying Democrats and Republicans are the same? There is no difference between a Trump and a Biden or Hillary Clinton, for instance. But let's hold that and open this up. Yes.
Okay.